In South China, there is this 100-kilometer-long wilderness trail called the Myterious Trail. And at first glance, it just seems like a pretty normal, beautiful hiking trail, until you begin to research what other hikers have said about what they experienced out on that trail. Let's just say some of their experiences are genuinely terrifying. And today, I'm going to tell you one of those experiences. It's about this man who goes solo hiking out on the Myterious Trail, and he comes in contact with something that neither he nor anybody else can explain. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to mail the like button's very important, time-sensitive job applications for them. But instead of mailing them, just immediately put them in the trash. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of June 18th, 2016, a 45-year-old hiker named Zhang Shenpeng stood at the entrance to the famous Myterious Wilderness Trail in southern China. He reached into his backpack, pulled out his phone, aimed it at the trail, and took a photo. Now, this trail was very beautiful, which is why he was taking a photo of it, but it also had a reputation for being a very dangerous trail. It was located in an area called the Saikung Peninsula, and the trail itself was about 100 kilometers long, or 62 miles, and it went through forests and mountains and streams, and the weather along this trail was very unpredictable, with sudden storms rolling in and just wreaking havoc. But Zhang was feeling very confident about this hike because he himself was an experienced hiker. While he maybe hadn't done this particular trail, he had hiked similar trails, and also the weather appeared to be holding up. However, before Zhang could even take a step onto this trail, the sky suddenly turned this dark greenish hue, and there was a loud thunderclap. I mean, basically instantly, there was this massive storm overhead. Zhang couldn't believe it. He just stood there watching as this unbelievable storm rolled in, wondering what he should do. I mean, again, he had not prepared for a storm. It was supposed to be nice out. But as he's kind of weighing whether or not he should just turn around and head back home because it was now too dangerous, the sky, just as suddenly as this all began, cleared. And it was suddenly beautiful and bright out, and the storm was gone. Now, at first, Zhang was not entirely convinced that the storm was now just magically gone. And so for a few minutes, he just stood there waiting in case it came back. But it didn't. The sky remained beautiful and clear. And so eventually, Zhang posted that photo he had taken of the trail, and he captioned it with something to the effect of, very strange weather out here, but I'm continuing my hike. And then after posting the photo, he put his phone away and began walking down the Myterious Trail. At first, as Zhang headed off into the forest, he made good time. It was warm out, but not too hot, and his pack was fairly light. And also, the views were just stunning. Every time he came to a rise on the trail, he could look out and see the waves of the South China Sea, and the air was so clear and crisp. I mean, it was a really relaxing and beautiful place to be. Certainly a big change from what he was used to, which was the noise and crowds of the city. And so Zhang just continued on his hike, stopping periodically to take more photos. But after about an hour of this hike, when things were still going really well, Zhang reached this fairly steep incline on the trail, and he began walking up it. There had been past inclines on the trail, and he had been fine. But as he began maneuvering up this particular incline, he began to feel kind of woozy. In fact, more specifically, he began to feel like the air all around him was getting really hot, like somebody was turning up the temperature all around him. And so Zhang, he stopped as he was making his way up this incline to kind of catch his breath. But as he did that, the heat just got worse and worse. He became delirious. And as he was almost towards the top of this hill, it was like he just couldn't go any further. And the world began to spin all around him. And before long, he was tumbling to the ground and blacking out. The next thing Zhang became aware of was the feeling of grass pressed up against his cheek. He was laying on the trail. So he kind of opened his eyes and he sat up for a second. He was very disoriented. He didn't know how long he had been out for. He figured it was only a couple of minutes. But as he kind of got his bearings, the first thing he noticed is the sky was now totally dark. And when he had passed out, it was broad daylight. And so he's thinking, that can't possibly be true. I can't have been here for hours. That's not possible. And so he began to think to himself like, oh, I guess another storm has rolled in. That's why the sky is so dark. It's not nighttime. But then when he reached into his bag and pulled out his phone and saw the time and saw it was 8 o'clock at night, He realized there was no storm. It really is nighttime. He had been unconscious on this trail for apparently like 12 hours. And so as Zhang just stared at his phone in disbelief, his phone began to ring, and it was his wife. And so Zhang's thinking, oh my goodness, I'm supposed to be home right now. My wife is definitely worried about me. And so pretty quickly he kind of composed himself, even though again, he has no idea what's happening here. And he answers the call, and as cheerful as he could, he told his wife that everything was fine, he was just running late and he would be home soon. And so she said, okay. And then after Zhang hung up with her, he put his phone back in his backpack and pulled out a flashlight. And then he stood up and kind of checked himself over for cuts and scrapes and bruises. You know, he had no idea what condition he was in here. But after checking himself over, he seemed okay. I mean, he was still very disoriented and confused, but physically he was okay. And then again, even though he doesn't understand what's happening here, he's just thinking, okay, I gotta turn around, get back to the car, and get home as quickly as possible. And so he slung his backpack, and with his flashlight out in front of him, he just started hoofing it back down the trail in the direction of his car. Now, as Zhang walked along, he was feeling very unsettled, but he kept telling himself that, you know, independent of whatever's happened here, he was gonna be home soon and everything was gonna be fine. However, not long into his return trip towards his car, he began to get this unbelievably bad feeling, like something was just totally wrong here. And as he began having this feeling, he suddenly took stock of the fact that the forest he was in, which had been so alive with life and sound and everything, was now completely silent. No insects, no animals. The stream nearby was making no sound. It was like he was in a void. And it was so eerie. And he stopped and just listened, and it was like the whole world was on mute. And so Zhang, who now was starting to feel scared, just began scanning his flashlight all around him, not even sure what he was looking for. But as he did, he had another realization. Suddenly the area he was in did not look familiar at all. I mean, he had only walked maybe several paces away from where he had just fallen to the trail and passed out. But now as he looked around, it was like he was in a totally different section of the forest. I mean, he looked back where he had fallen, and even in the grass where he would have been, it was untouched. There was no impression on the ground from where he would have been laying for 12 hours, like he'd been transported somewhere else without knowing it. Now, when Zhang spoke to his wife on the phone, he was very careful not to alarm her, even though he had sort of a growing sense of panic inside of him. But now, you know, the whole situation was sort of out of hand. He really didn't understand what was happening, and he knew he needed help. And so he reached into his backpack to pull out his phone to call for help, except when he reached into his bag, there was nothing there. His phone was gone, his supplies were gone, the bag was totally empty, even though literally minutes before it had been full. Like there was no way he just randomly lost this stuff. It had been there, and now it was gone. And so Zhang desperately looked on the ground with his flashlight, and he walked back in the direction where he believed he had fallen, even though it didn't look like the same place. He's looking all over the place like, you know, maybe he did drop his stuff, but he didn't. It was just gone. And so now, really feeling scared, Zhang just completely lost his composure and began screaming at the top of his lungs for help. But he heard nothing in response, just silence. And then not long after that, Zhang's head began to feel heavy again, and then he sank to the ground, put his head in the dirt, and he closed his eyes. Hey guys, I have an incredible announcement. Something I know is gonna absolutely make your day, something many of you may have waited years for me to say again. Beginning the first full week in the new year, so the week of January 5th, I am gonna go from one measly upload on this channel a week to 2, 3, even 4 uploads a week. You heard that right, we're going back to 2, 3, even 4 times a week. You guys have been telling me that you want me to release more videos, and well, I and our whole team have been listening. So as always, make sure your notifications are on so you don't miss any of these amazing extra weekly uploads. It will not replace what you're already getting. This is all in addition to. It's gonna be great. See you guys soon. When Zhang woke up, it was bright out, and he also was now magically back at the original spot where he had passed out on that steep incline. And the first thing he did as soon as he came to is he reached into his bag, hoping that his phone and other supplies would have just materialized by now. But no, when he reached inside the bag, it was still empty. And so on the one hand, Zhang still is like, what is going on here? I don't understand what's happening. And then on the other, he was also becoming acutely aware that because he doesn't have his phone, he can't call for help. Like, he's stuck out here. And so he's wondering, like, what is he gonna do here? And then it dawns on him that, it's been at least several hours since he last spoke to his wife, and she was expecting him home the night before. And so by now, certainly, because he hasn't come home, she must have called the police. And so maybe there was already a search party out here looking for him. And so suddenly feeling kind of hopeful that that was actually happening, Zhang, despite his confusion and disorientation here, just scooped up his backpack, put it on, and began walking down the trail back in the direction towards his car. And as he walked, Zhang periodically would call out, hoping that again, some searchers or other hikers were nearby who would hear him and come to his aid. But after hiking for over an hour, he still had not reached his car. The forest was still eerily silent, like everything was silent. He hadn't seen or heard anybody else. I mean, he's totally alone here. And so Zhang started to wonder if maybe his best bet was not to try to hike out of here, but instead to just stay put and wait for, hopefully, the search party, if there was one out there, to come find him, or maybe some other hiker to come find him. However, as he was considering this, he looked up ahead where the trail kind of turned, and he saw there was this pond, a pond he had not seen on the way in, but nonetheless, there was a pond basically right over there. And from his perspective, he could see kind of through the trees on the other side of the pond appeared to be a person. Zhang suddenly felt this enormous sense of relief. Here was the person who was going to help him and get him out of here. And so Zhang began walking towards this person, and as he did, he cupped his hands and he called out a hello to get this person's attention. Now, when Zhang did this, he believed this person would either, one, hear him, turn around and see what Zhang wanted, or two, they wouldn't hear him, and they would just continue to stand there with their back to him. But neither of those things happened. When Zhang called out this very hearty hello, this person just instantly began sprinting away from Zhang without even turning to look at him. They just began taking off into the trees. And Zhang, he's thinking like this is a crisis for him. He has no idea what's happening here. This is the first person he's seen. He needs them. And so instinctively, Zhang just took off running after them, calling out the whole time, trying to reassure them that he was not a threat. He didn't mean to scare them. He needs their help. And so he gets to the pond. He runs around the perimeter. He can still see this person running off into the woods. And Zhang, like he's so exhausted from the lack of water and food, he's not feeling his best, but somehow through adrenaline alone, he starts gaining on this person. And eventually he closes the distance on this person as they're weaving through the trees. And suddenly this person just stops. And they don't turn around and look at Zhang, they just stop in the middle of the woods. And Zhang, he almost barrels into them because he had been running so quickly, and he just stops. And he's staring at the back of this person who still has not turned around to look at him at any point. And Zhang says to them, "Please, I need your help." And Zhang, he's panting, he's totally out of breath. And this person who's been running at top speed the whole time, they're not out of breath. They're not even moving. They're stationary, just with their back to Zhang. And suddenly, as Zhang is staring at this person, realizing that something feels off here, the person begins to turn around to look at him. And as they do, Zhang suddenly feels this incredible sense of dread. Like he chased this person down, he needs their help, but now that they're turning around to face him, something feels wrong and he doesn't want to see him. Something's off here. And then the person fully turns around and looks at Zhang. And Zhang is suddenly so terrified of what he sees, he holds his breath and just stays there frozen to the spot, staring. He can't believe what he's looking at. This was not a person. This was some sort of shadowy figure with no face, and it was now staring directly at Zhang. And Zhang, again, he's so scared he can't move, he's holding his breath, he's just looking right back at them, and then suddenly this figure takes an aggressive step toward Zhang, and then another, until suddenly they're inches away from Zhang, and Zhang is so terrified, he just closes his eyes, expecting to die at any second, and then when he opens his eyes, the figure's just gone. For about 5 minutes, Zhang just stood there, shaking in utter disbelief of what he had just experienced. I mean, this whole thing had been terrifying, but this specific interaction with this shadow figure was horrifying, and he had no idea how to process it. But at the same time, after a few minutes, Zhang's thinking to himself, I don't want to stay around here to try to figure out what's going on. I need to get out of here. And so Zhang finally, after mustering the courage, he turns to start walking back towards the pond and back up to the trail. But when he turns around, The pond isn't there anymore. It's just this endless expanse of trees. The pond should have been right there, and it's gone. And also, when Zhang took off running after this shadow figure, it was daylight. And now, it's darkness. It's total darkness. And so once again, Zhang has somehow gone to a new location and jumped through time, several hours at least, with no idea how that had even happened. And also, as he's having this realization that once again, it's like space-time has changed all around him, he starts to have that heaviness in his head, things start to swim all around him, and before long, he's fallen to the ground and he's closing his eyes. When Zhang woke up again, it was now suddenly bright out. So again, more time has passed. He was not just passed out for a minute or two, it was several hours at least. And also, Zhang was now magically laying right next to the pond that had vanished the night before after this figure had showed up. And so at this point, Zhang is seriously thinking to himself that he must have lost his mind. That's what's happening here. He's gone insane. Or does he have some horrible head injury that's like causing hallucinations or something? Like, he doesn't know. But at the same time, all he can do at this point is just get up, try to get back to the trail, and try to get back to his car and get back home. That's all he can do. And so that's what he did. Zhang made his way back up to the trail and began walking down the trail in the direction that he believed was back towards his car. But after hiking for a while, things did not look any more familiar. It was like he was hiking down a brand new trail that he had never been on before. The forest continued to be eerily silent, and every time he called out for help, he got nothing in response. And then eventually, Zhang reached a section of the trail that kind of sloped down, and when he got there and he looked out ahead of him, he saw down below there was this huge cemetery. Now, Zhang had studied this entire area before coming out on this hike, and he knew there was no cemetery in the middle of the MacLehose Trail. Like, this can't be here. But remember, by this point, Zhang has seen and experienced things that he cannot understand. So he doesn't even know what's real and what's not anymore. And so as he's looking at the cemetery, he told himself this has got to be some hallucination. This can't be here. But after walking down the hill and entering the cemetery, he reached out and touched the headstones, and they were very real. This cemetery absolutely, for right now anyways, was real and right in front of him. And as he looked at the dates on these headstones, he could tell the cemetery was at least 200 years old. And so as Zhang is taking in this new information, he looks up and he sees a couple hundred meters away from him is a group of what appears to be people clustered around a grave. And for a moment, Zhang feels this unbelievable sense of relief. Here we go, there's some people here. You know, they're visiting their relatives. They can help me. But before Zhang ran over there and asked for their help, he watched one of them sort of turn their bodies and they looked back at Zhang. And instantly Zhang's body was overcome with terror once again. Because this person was not a person. This was a faceless, dark figure, just like the one he had encountered near the pond. And there was this horrible sense that this thing was looking right at him. And so horrified, Zhang just turned and ran away. That night, Zhang found himself inexplicably back at that small pond. Didn't even know how he got there, but at this point, he wasn't questioning anything, because he didn't understand any of this. And as he was next to this pond, at some point, he had that heaviness come over him, and before long, he was on the ground, closing his eyes. However, this time, as he sort of slept or became unconscious, he entered into this sort of dream state where he became aware that there were whispers all around him. Somebody or something was trying to communicate with him, and at first he couldn't tell what it was. But then he realized it was like the earth was talking to him. It was like the rocks and the nearby water were literally speaking to him. And for some reason, this felt sort of comforting, even though again, he has no idea what to make of this. And then when Zhang woke up again, it was bright out, and all of a sudden Zhang was aware that the forest was alive again. There were sounds coming from everywhere, animals, insects, there was water sounds. It was like things were back to normal. And Zhang, he also had this incredible clear-headedness that he hadn't had for the past several days. It really was like things had gone back to normal. And so Zhang stood up and he heard the sound of running water nearby, and he followed it to a stream. And so he decided he would just follow this stream right on out of the MacLehose Trail. Like this was gonna be the way he would get out of here. But after walking for hours and hours along the stream, he still had not found his way out. The sun was now directly overhead, beaming down on him. He was so hot, he was tired, he was moving slower and slower. His optimism was beginning to fade. And then he looked up, and just up ahead, he saw something that destroyed any of the optimism he had left. Because right up ahead were 3 more shadow figures with their back to him. It was like they were blocking his way towards freedom. And so as Zhang tensed up and prepared to turn and run back deeper into this trail that he was trying to escape, one of these shadow figures turned and they looked directly at Zhang. And when they did, everything changed. Because Zhang instantly realized this was no shadow figure. This was a real person. They had a face, and they were calling out to him saying, "Hey, do you need any help?" And Zhang was so relieved, so happy. He couldn't even say anything back. He just fell to his knees and wept tears of joy. He was finally saved. It would turn out Zhang's wife had called the police on that first night when Zhang didn't come home. And so the whole time Zhang was out in the woods over these several days, there was actually a massive search party out there looking for him. However, none of the searchers claimed to have seen or heard Zhang at any point, and Zhang did not see or hear any of the searchers. Those people at the end who finally rescued him were just random hikers that happened to see him. But somehow, despite the fact that Zhang really could not have gone very far from his car, I mean, he really didn't cover a huge distance on this trail when this whole experience began, despite that, the searchers never heard or saw Zhang at any point, and Zhang obviously never heard or saw any of them. So they're basically in the exact same area, looking for each other, but nobody sees each other. After being discovered by those 3 real people on Myterious trail, Zhang was taken to a hospital where he was examined, and it was determined there was nothing physically wrong with him other than he had not had much to eat or drink in several days. In fact, the official explanation for what happened to Zhang was just that he was really dehydrated. However, Zhang didn't buy that explanation. And when Zhang left the hospital and got back home, he immediately began digging into the history of the Myterious Trail, and he would quickly discover that he was not the first person to have a totally wild, bizarre, borderline paranormal experience out on that trail. It would turn out the Myterious Trail cuts across a geographic line called the Sai Kung Barrier. This is an area of the Sai Kung Peninsula that is generally considered to be a portal to other dimensions. And there have been enough people to have otherworldly experiences out on this trail that loosely match what Zhang claims to have seen and experienced, that they dubbed the area this trail is in as the Bermuda Triangle of South China. And adding even more intrigue to this area is the fact that several other very experienced hikers have gone missing along this trail, and they've had huge search parties sent out for them, but they were never found. Zhang would eventually share his story of what happened to him out on the trail in a 3,500-word essay that he posted on social media. He, and many others, believe that when he first fell and collapsed on the trail, that he actually fell through the Sai Kung Barrier and entered another dimension. That for those days that he was wandering around having no idea what was happening to him, that he wasn't really in this dimension anymore. He was somewhere else. Zhang believed the only reason he was able to escape this other dimension was because on his final night in this other place, he began to hear the sounds of the rocks and the water whispering to him. He said the only reason he was able to hear that was because he had sort of accepted his fate, that here he was in this totally strange world that he couldn't understand and didn't have any real expectation to escape from. And it was that sort of resignation that he allowed himself to feel that kind of put him in touch with this dimension, and he believes that's what ultimately allowed him to come back home. Despite those who doubt him, Zhang stands by his version of events. While his time on the trail did not cause him any physical harm, to this day he is still haunted by it. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm gonna tell you 2 stories that really have shock endings. I mean, the plot twists in both these stories are absolutely worth waiting for. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please remove the batteries from the like button's TV remote, and then once they're out, go ahead and use super glue and glue the back on. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the night of May 3rd, 1897, a 43-year-old widow named Mary Titus lay in her bed inside of her house in the small town of Plymouth, Pennsylvania. And Mary, as she laid there, she just could not fall asleep because she kept hearing this strange tapping sound coming from somewhere in her house. Eventually, Mary just stopped trying to fall asleep altogether, and she just sat up and just listened really intently to figure out, where the sound is coming from. But she just couldn't do it. It was sort of erratic, and it seemed like it was coming from all over the house, and at one point it felt like it was right below her, and then it was over here. I mean, it really was hard to pinpoint where it was even coming from, let alone what was actually causing it. And then on top of that, the volume of this tapping was also changing. Sometimes it would get really loud, and then it would be super faint and she could barely hear it. But it was still there, somewhere in her house. But then, sort of inexplicably, the tapping sound just abruptly stopped. Mary is sitting up in bed, it's 2, 3 in the morning, and it's just silence in her house. And at that point, Mary told herself, okay, well, clearly it was some animal, or maybe it's a branch tapping on the outside of her house or something. She's rationalizing the sound. It's gone now, so it can't be harmful, and I should just stop thinking about it and actually go to sleep now. But shortly after laying her head back down on the pillow, when she was almost asleep, she started hearing this sound again. And again, she just could not tell where it was coming from. Now, Mary, she was a widow, but she did have somebody else who lived with her in the house. It was her daughter, her 18-year-old daughter, whose name was Cora. Cora's father and Mary's husband had passed away tragically 11 years earlier in this terrible mining explosion. And really, even though it had been 11 years, Mary and Cora were still very much living in the shadow and the grief of, his death. This is something that they really had never been able to move past. And so as Mary is laying here in bed and she's hearing this tapping sound starting again, part of her thinks maybe it's Cora, maybe she's doing something. But really, what was going through her head when this tapping sound began again was how utterly alone she felt and how badly she missed her husband. Like, she really just wished he was here, because then she would have told him, hey, go investigate. I'm gonna stay here. You go make sure the house is safe. But obviously he was gone. He'd been gone for over a decade. And so eventually, even though Mary really didn't want to get up and go look for this tapping sound, because truthfully, she was just scared at this point, but she's thinking about her daughter, Cora, who's downstairs, and heaven forbid there's some problem in the house. Maybe an animal has literally gotten into the house and it could be hazardous. She doesn't know, so she needs to go and be the brave one and go find out where the sound is coming from and make sure her daughter's okay. And on top of that, her daughter, Cora, had recently had this really bad case of strep throat. And while she was recovering, she really was not back to 100%. And so Mary told herself, this is an opportunity as much as anything to go down and just check on her daughter and make sure she's okay. And so finally, Mary musters the courage and she takes her sheets off and she gets up out of her bed. And at the same time, the tapping is sort of rocketing all around the house. It's all over the place. And right as Mary steps onto the ground, she's out of her bed, the tapping stops. Mary starts walking towards the door and there's nothing. She gets to the door, she opens it up, she listens, she's looking out, but there's nothing. And the house is completely silent. And there was something kind of eerie about it. It's like the sound was responding to Mary's actions. And suddenly all of Mary's courage evaporated. And she thought, you know what? The sound has stopped. Everything's okay. I'm sure Cora's okay. I'm getting back in bed and I'm going to sleep. And that's what she did. She rushed back to her bed. She did not go check on Cora. She just got under the sheets, pulled him up to her chin, and just hoped the sound wouldn't come back. And it didn't. And eventually, Mary fell asleep. The following morning, when Mary woke up, she immediately kind of took stock and realized, okay, I'm okay. Everything seems fine in the house. She listened and didn't hear any knocking sounds. And she quickly got up, she got dressed, she went downstairs into the kitchen, and Cora was actually already down there doing some needlepoint, and she seemed perfectly fine, albeit still recovering from her strep throat. But she was okay. She was in the kitchen in good spirits. And so Mary just kind of, breathed a sigh of relief here. Even though, again, she really has no idea what that tapping was. She has no idea if it was sinister or not. This could be totally benign, but there was just something uneasy about it. And so it was just really nice to come down here and have life be totally normal. And so pretty quickly, Mary just fell into her everyday routine. She began prepping some food for her and Cora to eat, and then she and her daughter just started chatting. At no point did Mary bring up the tapping sound, in part because she didn't really even know what they meant. She was kind of spooked by it, didn't want to scare her daughter, so it never came up. But they're chatting, having their completely normal morning, when suddenly there's very clear and fairly loud tapping that starts not in the kitchen, but below the kitchen, in the cellar. And as soon as the tapping starts, Mary immediately stops because she recognized it as the same sounds she was hearing the night before that spooked her so badly. And she looked over at Cora without saying anything, just seeing if maybe Cora heard the noises too. And Cora as well is looking at her mom like, "Did you hear that?" And Mary's like, "You heard that too? You heard that tapping?" And Cora's like, "Yeah, I think it's coming from the cellar." And Mary, she's like, I could have sworn I heard that tapping last night. It was actually keeping me up. And Cora, she said, "Well, it sounds like it's in the cellar. Maybe we have mice down there and they're rummaging around or something. That's probably what it is." And so Mary, who at this point is desperate to find a logical, non-scary explanation for what's going on here, just immediately goes down the stairs into the cellar and begins looking for mice that would prove that's all this is. It's mice making these sounds. But when she's down there, she's looking around and there's no mice, there's no sign of mice. And as she's down there, she starts hearing the tapping again. But now it's not coming from the cellar where they thought the sounds were originating. It's coming from somewhere above her. And as soon as Mary hears this tapping sound, she hears Cora reacting to it upstairs in the kitchen, like she was kind of startled by it. And so Mary runs back upstairs to the kitchen. She looks at Cora, and Cora is visibly distressed because she's like, "I heard it. It was in here. It was in the kitchen or somewhere nearby. I didn't see anything, but I heard it. As soon as you went down there, I heard it." And so at this point, Mary is undeniably scared. She doesn't know what this is, but it's gotten to the point where she cannot deny there is something strange happening in her house. Her daughter has now fully corroborated that. And so Mary said, "You know what? I'm going next door." They had a friend who lived next door, a guy that actually used to work with Mary's husband, who was sort of like their handyman and the guy they would call on to kind of help them around the house. And so Mary, she left her house and she went next door, knocked on this guy's door. And when he came, she explained that there's something happening. There's knocking sounds happening in my house. It's scaring me and Cora. We can't figure out what it is. Can you please come take a look? And he was like, "Absolutely, I'll be over in a second." And so Mary goes back to her house and she and Cora are standing in the kitchen, and periodically they're hearing these tapping sounds. And then the neighbor, he comes over. He comes inside, and right away, when he comes in, he starts to hear the tapping too. And Mary's like, "What is that?" And Cora, she's totally spooked. And the guy's like, "I think it's your pipes. I think that's all this is. It sounds very much like your pipes are banging against the wood inside your house or something. So let me just check your plumbing. That's probably what this is." And so Mary and Cora, they're like, "Great. He seems pretty confident that that's all this is." And so Mary and Cora, they kind of hover around the neighbor as he begins to check the kitchen and the bathroom plumbing. But as he's checking all the pipes and the fittings and kind of looking for the origin of these strange tapping sounds, he realizes as he's checking all these different areas that as he's checking them, the tapping sound is persisting and it's not coming from the pipes. Sometimes it sort of seems like the tapping is coming from near the pipes, but other times, as he's working right here, the tapping sound is coming from somewhere else on the other side of the house. And eventually, Mary and Cora started to sense that the neighbor, who had come in very confident that this was no big deal, was starting to show signs that he too felt a little uncomfortable, like something was off here. And then, sort of out of nowhere, when the tapping got really loud, and it was now apparent, not only to this guy, but also to Mary and Cora, that the tapping could not be coming from the plumbing because it's nowhere near here, it's behind us. And the man, he turned around and he looked at Mary and Cora. His face is ashen, he really looked pretty upset. And he said, "The last time I heard this sound was in the mine. It was when your husband was killed in that explosion. He died, but other men got trapped in the mine behind all this rubble from the explosion, and they couldn't get out. And they were tapping on the rocks over and over again until they all died. That's what this sounds like." After that, the man just got up and hastily left and just told them, "I'm sorry, I can't help you." And he was out the door and back over to his house. And so Mary and Cora, they're left wondering, what do we even do? Who do we talk to? What's happening here? But for Mary specifically, even though she couldn't believe that this guy had just told her that, what a horrible thing to tell her. I mean, he knows she's grieving the loss of her husband. How could you possibly say that to me? But she's thinking about what he told her. That it sounds like the tapping of these doomed men, including her husband, tapping on the mine walls before they perished. And she started to wonder, what if these are ghosts? What if it's my husband and these men who died in the mines 11 years ago trying to get my attention? What if they're trying to communicate with me? Over the next 4 days, the tapping sound inside of their house continued. And the story about what was happening here spread all across town. In fact, all sorts of neighbors and actually news outlets were coming to Mary and Cora's house to hear the tapping sounds for themselves. And when they'd come in the house, Mary would walk them around the house. And sure enough, the reporters, the neighbors, they'd all hear the tapping sounds, and nobody could explain it. It was like this unbelievable phenomenon. And Mary and Cora, by this point, I mean, they were convinced that these sounds were very likely, Mary's dead husband and the other men who perished in the mine. Finally, on May 9th, so 6 days after this haunting began, by this point, the story is out in newspapers, people are talking about it all over the place, and in some ways that legitimized Mary and Cora's plight. But they also really didn't know what to do about this. This had become sort of a spectacle, but nobody had any solutions for them. So Mary and Cora, they're sitting at the table weighing out their options. Like, what do we even do? Even if this is, our dead husband, our dead father trying to communicate with us, we can't live with this. This is kind of terrifying. And if it just goes on, do we eventually move? And so they're having that kind of discussion. And as they're sitting at the kitchen table, suddenly the tapping starts again. Except now, the tapping sound is so close. It's practically on top of Mary and Cora, so much so that their conversation immediately stopped when this tapping started, and they both kind of looked at each other like, it's right on top of us, what's going on? And then as this tapping continued, they realized it was basically right below them, almost like in the cellar, right underneath them. And so Mary sort of reflexively leaned back in her chair, just kind of trying to get out of, the bubble of this really intimate, close tapping sound that they were in. And as she's sitting back, she saw something she had never noticed before. And immediately, she understood what was going on. It would turn out the tapping sounds that were plaguing Mary and Cora were not being caused by Mary's dead husband or the other men that died in the mines 11 years ago. However, the actual origin of these tapping sounds was in some ways equally as bizarre. So Cora had recently had a bad case of strep throat, and she was doing better, but she still was feeling kind of under the weather. And that was in part because the bacteria that causes strep throat was still in her system. And that same bacteria is also responsible for causing a totally different condition known as Sydenham's chorea, which Cora also had. In fact, she had it likely at the same time that she had strep throat. And Sydenham's chorea has a very different set of symptoms to strep throat. This condition, which is also known as the dancing plague, causes your body to have these involuntary movements that the person who has this condition is often totally unaware of. These people can flail around suddenly and not even know they're doing it. And so what was happening is Cora was making the tapping sound, but had no idea she was making the tapping sound because it was being caused by Sydenham's chorea. Now, it seems like, well, how didn't Mary catch on that her own daughter is tapping her feet or flicking her hand and causing this tapping sound? Well, the reality was, when the tapping first started, a lot of times Mary was not in the same room as her daughter. And her daughter did not know she was making the tapping sounds. So her daughter is genuinely scared of the tapping sounds because she doesn't know she's making them. And Mary doesn't know it's her daughter making them. And so combined, they're like, oh my gosh, what's happening in our house? And then before long, they had kind of gone down this path of, it's my dead husband, it's my dead father, he's the one making these sounds. And then it's like they had tunnel vision, as did all the other neighbors, as did the reporters. Everybody wanted this in some ways to be a haunting. And so nobody's checking to see if maybe Cora is tapping her feet or hands and creating these tapping sounds. Because again, Cora was fully convinced she was not making those sounds. But then finally, when she and her mom were sitting at the table discussing what they were gonna do 6 days after the haunting began, and they hear this really intense, close tapping sound, when Mary kind of leaned back to kind of take stock of the room and figure out what was going on, she noticed under the table Cora's foot stomping on the ground. Cora didn't know it was Sydenham's chorea. One afternoon in November of 2021, a middle-aged woman named Nicole Petit was on break at her job in the city of Decatur, Alabama. And while she was sitting in the break room, she pulled out her phone and she called her 21-year-old daughter, Hannah. The phone rang a couple of times, but then eventually Hannah picked up, and right away, Nicole could tell her daughter, Hannah, was still very much not feeling well. She could hear it clearly in her voice. So Nicole's daughter was a stay-at-home mom to two very young kids, which, was totally exhausting in its own right. And in fact, on this phone call, Nicole could hear in the background the sound of the kids yelling and running around and crashing into things, so clearly it was just chaos over there. But Nicole knew Hannah could not just be tired from tending to her kids, because over the last couple of months, what Nicole had noticed was every time she spoke to her daughter, whether her daughter's kids were going crazy or not, Hannah just completely sounded under the weather. And in fact, Hannah often was complaining, again over the past few months, of not only feeling a deep exhaustion, but also of feeling really dizzy and nauseous. Now, over the past few months, Nicole had been telling her daughter, you have to go see a doctor. This is not normal. This is not just parenting fatigue. Something is off. You need to go get looked at. But Hannah, who was known to be very, very tough and, generally didn't really go to the doctor much, she said to her mom, I'm fine. I'm just exhausted from the kids. It's no big deal. And so she kind of pushed that idea aside. And so this time, as Nicole's talking to her daughter and she can clearly hear that her daughter is not better, she's still feeling awful, she knew trying to push her daughter to go see the doctor wasn't going to work. So instead, she said, okay, Hannah, when's Brian going to be home? Brian was Hannah's husband. And Hannah just sighed and she said, no, he's not home yet. I don't know when he's going to be here. So for the most part, Brian was, a very active parent and husband, but he also was a very successful chiropractor. And in fact, he had had so much success at his private practice that recently he'd even been able to fully renovate his building. And so with this new building and all this extra space and all this new staff, he was working even more than usual, which, financially was great for the family. But it meant he basically was absent all the time. And so it had become kind of commonplace that Brian was nowhere to be seen. It was kind of Hannah alone with the kids and this mystery illness she was suffering from. Now, Nicole obviously understood the nuance here. She knew that, Brian's practice was very important, not just to him, but to Hannah and their family. And so instead of, being upset with Brian, Nicole had tried very hard to make herself available to her daughter, to take care of her kids, to help her out whenever she could. But there was a limit to how much Nicole could help because Nicole also worked full time. And so she couldn't just be around all the time to help with her daughter. Like today, she was working. She wished she wasn't so she could go be with her daughter, but that was just the way it was. For the next couple of minutes, Nicole and Hannah just chatted like mother and daughter. And then at some point towards the end of the call, like Nicole always did, she told her daughter, hey, I really think you ought to go to the doctor. If you tell me what day you're gonna go and you make an appointment, I'll go over and take care of your kids. I'll even take you to the appointment, whatever you need. Don't let logistics be the reason you don't see a doctor. Whatever you need, you let me know and I will help you if I can. I'll flex my schedule to accommodate yours. But like Hannah always did, she just kind of brushed off her mom and said, okay, maybe I'll go see a doctor. I don't know, but I think I'm gonna be fine. I'm gonna rest, I'm gonna take vitamins, I'm gonna eat well, I'm gonna do all the things, and I'm sure this will pass. Nicole sighed when she heard this because basically she hears her daughter saying, I'm not going to the doctor still. But Nicole didn't argue. She just told her daughter that she loved her and she would see her soon, and then the two hung up. Over the next few weeks, Hannah continued to feel completely awful, nauseous, dizzy. All of her symptoms persisted and in some ways even got worse. But no matter how much pressure was put on her, namely by her mom, to go see a doctor, Hannah didn't. She really had convinced herself that this was just, parenting fatigue and that she would just get through it and she would be fine, which again was sort of very much her personality. She was this tough, hard-charging woman. She was gonna just grit this one out. But then finally, in January of 2022, so now it's been months and months of Hannah having these symptoms and her mom basically begging her to go see a doctor. And by this point, Hannah can't argue with the fact that she is basically falling apart. She's lost so much weight, she actually can't even walk around her house anymore. She literally sits on a swivel chair, like a desk chair, and just pushes herself around the house. She is absolutely sick, and it's something that she can't even deny anymore. And so finally, in January of 2022, Hannah says, okay, Mom, I'll go to the hospital. Nicole, in some ways, was incredibly relieved that finally her daughter is doing the thing she should have done a long time ago. And then also, Nicole was just so annoyed with her daughter. Why didn't you go sooner? This is so silly. But regardless, Nicole's great. She tells her daughter, I'm gonna come over, pick you up, I'm gonna take you to the hospital, I'll be there with you. And so she goes over to Hannah's house, and when she gets there, Hannah in her chair wheels over to the door, and Hannah looks awful. She looks like she weighs less than 100 pounds. She's so pale. Her hair looks like it's falling out. I mean, she looks absolutely sick. She looks like there's something seriously wrong with her. But Nicole, she just takes her daughter and assists her down the stairs, puts her in the car. She also gets her kids and brings them along as well, and they drive to the hospital. And when they get there, eventually Hannah is brought into an exam room along with Nicole and the kids, and a nurse comes in and they begin checking Hannah's vital signs and asking her some questions, and they also weighed Hannah. And eventually, after that was done, the nurse told Hannah that, hey, you only weigh 84 pounds. This is way below what's considered healthy. This is like an emergency. And based on the other things you're telling me about over the last few months having these symptoms, I'm worried you might actually have stomach cancer. Now, even though Nicole had anticipated that something seriously was wrong with her daughter, it still hit her like a freight train to hear that her 21-year-old daughter had stomach cancer. I mean, she'd never even heard of somebody that young having stomach cancer. And when Nicole looked over at her daughter, Hannah too was horrified. I mean, for her, she still believed this was all just gonna pass. Whatever this is, it'll go away. But obviously, stomach cancer is not something that just goes away. A couple minutes later, a doctor came in the room and explained to Hannah and Nicole that the next step here was to test Hannah to see if she actually had stomach cancer. Now, the doctor said it was entirely possible this could be something else, but again, based on all the symptoms you've described and the sudden extreme weight loss, unfortunately, this really does appear to be stomach cancer. But we're gonna check, and in a couple of days, we should have an answer. And so Nicole and Hannah, despite obviously being shocked and scared, they both said, whatever we need to do, that's what we're gonna do. A few days later, Nicole was at home when her phone rang, and it was her daughter calling. Now, to this point, Hannah had gone in and begun doing some of the tests to see if she had stomach cancer, and they were waiting for some of the results to come back. And so when Nicole saw this call coming in, she's thinking, oh my goodness, this could be it. I could be getting the call where Hannah has been told one way or the other about this being stomach cancer. And so with quite a bit of anxiety, Nicole answered the phone. And when she heard her daughter was not telling her about test results. Her daughter, she was speaking in such a low tone that she could barely hear her, but she basically croaked out to her mother that she felt so sick, she had to be taken to the hospital right now. And so Nicole, she dropped everything, sped over to her daughter's house, and when she found Hannah inside, it was like Hannah could barely move. She was so fatigued, she was so sick, so pale, so skinny and malnourished. It was like her daughter was dying. And so she scooped her daughter up and she rushed her to the hospital. Later that day, Hannah was in a hospital room and was stabilized. When she had come in, she actually was showing signs of what's called acute respiratory failure, which basically meant her lungs were shutting down. And in fact, one of her doctors had told Nicole that had Nicole not gone over there and rushed her daughter to the hospital on that day, very likely she would have died. She would not have survived another 24 hours at home. So this was as close as you can come to, your daughter dying. But they had been able to stabilize Hannah, and she was now resting in bed, and they were now trying to figure out what to do. And one of the doctors pulled Nicole aside and said, look, we know she's being tested for stomach cancer, and we don't know if she has that or not yet. But acute respiratory failure is not connected to stomach cancer. And on top of that, it's incredibly rare for someone as young as Hannah. So we really don't know what's going on here. All we can do is keep her here, keep her stable, monitor her, and run some additional tests. And so Nicole, she said, okay, let's do it. And so for a few days, that's what the medical staff did. They just continued to monitor and keep Hannah stable while testing her to figure out how somebody her age and in her condition could be contracting respiratory failure. But after a few days of this, out of nowhere, Hannah has this severe sudden seizure. But after her seizure passed, the medical staff began investigating Hannah's brain because a seizure is a brain-related event. And as they're looking into Hannah's brain, they discover that she has also contracted viral meningitis, which is inflammation of the membranes surrounding the brain. And generally speaking, viral meningitis is not life-threatening, but in rare cases, it can be. And considering the fact that Hannah had other very serious medical issues going on, and the fact that her particular viral meningitis case was very severe. Doctors were worried that she could be someone who could die from this meningitis, or potentially have very serious brain damage if they didn't do something drastic to combat this swelling in her brain. And so a decision was made to put Hannah into a medically induced coma so that she would lay perfectly still and they could just wait for the swelling in her brain to go down. But what that meant functionally was that Hannah would be in this coma indefinitely until, the swelling goes down in her brain or who knows what. I mean, basically the doctors didn't know what was going on with her. However, just a couple of days after Hannah had been placed in this medically induced coma, some of her imaging tests came back from all the testing they had run on Hannah to try to figure out what was going on here. And in particular, there were these imaging tests that came back from her abdomen. They had scanned her abdomen. And what they discovered inside of her abdomen was truly shocking. Hannah's entire digestive tract was covered in white spots. And the doctors all knew that those spots were not cancer. They were something worse. And after running a few more tests to confirm their theory, once they had that information that, yep, what we suspect is going on here, they called the police. So remember Hannah's husband, Brian? He's the very successful chiropractor. Well, his practice had been so successful that he had had the funds to fully renovate his office and build this bigger, better chiropractic practice. And that was great, not just for him, but also for Hannah, her whole family. They were making money hand over fist. Everything was great. Except there was an issue. One of the upgrades that Brian wanted to do within this renovated space was to include an X-ray room. And when people build X-ray rooms, they actually line the walls of the room with these big sheets of lead to keep the radiation from penetrating the walls. But lead is incredibly toxic and harmful to humans, especially if you ingest it or you touch it. It's not something you really want to interact with at all. It needs to be kept at a safe distance. But after the renovations were done and the X-ray room was built, there were several sheets of lead that didn't make it into the walls. They were sort of extra sheets of lead that just didn't get used and they were out in the open. And when police discovered that and they began investigating, they found somebody had been shaving off pieces of those extra lead sheets, little bits of lead. They were shaving them off and planting them inside of Hannah's vitamins that she took religiously every day, believing those were the things that were gonna make her healthy again. But in reality, sort of ironically, they were doing the opposite. She was literally poisoning herself every time she took one of those vitamins. And who was the person who was shaving off all that lead and literally trying to kill Hannah? Her own husband, Brian. All those white spots inside of Hannah's digestive tract were literally just pools of lead that had accumulated inside of her because her husband had been trying to poison her to death for months. Miraculously though, Hannah would survive. After nearly 2 months in a medically induced coma, Hannah was healthy enough to be woken up and got to go back home with her kids. As for Brian, he was arrested, found guilty of attempted murder, and sentenced to life in prison. His motive was the $1.3 million in life insurance policies that he had taken out on Hannah. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
এত পূর্ণ আমি কোন সময় উঠছিলাম বলে আল্লাহ তোমার মতো একটা মানুষ আমাকে কি লেগে দিব
দেন চিকুর দেন চিকুর দেন
আল্লাহ গো এইটা আমাগো ছাগল আল্লাহ এইবার এই ছাগল দিয়ে আমরা কুরবানি দিব
ভাত খেয়ে যা
না না খাওয়ান লাগবো না আমি যে বাড়িতে না ভাত তরকারি রাইন দিয়েছি
উট কুরবানিতে ঢাকা না লাগবো এখন ইন্টারনেটের যুগ ফেসবুকে ছবি দেখো
জুতো নাই থাকলে জুতো দিয়ে পিটাইতাম চলেন আসেন
হ্যাঁ এরকম ফুটানি মাইরাই বেড়ায় দুনিয়ার দাঁত দানা করছে কিরে খাড়াই রইছিস কেন খাওয়ান দিছি তো খাইতে আয়
দাওয়াতে গিয়ে আমার খাইতে ভাল লাগে না। অনেক মানুষ আছে না আশের মতন ক্যাত ক্যাত করে গলা পর্যন্ত খায়।
1 কেজি খাসির মাংস আনতে পারবেন?
ঢিলা পানি ঢিলা স্বপ্নও ভাবি নাই।
সে পচতেছে বিদেশে আর আমার আচার পচতেছে এইখানে।
দেখবেন হুট করে কার ছাগল লয়ে আইছেন?
মতিন মিয়া নামে এক বুইরা লোকের ছাগল। পেটে সমস্যা নাকি?
হ্যাঁ না গেছে গা, ঠিক আছে।
এত চিন্তা করার কি আছে? উপরে আল্লাহ আছে না? চা খাইবেন?
তোরা রিক্সা উঠতো আমি দিয়া হি তখন।
সি 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 ভাইজান, এটা কি কনা?
আমি নামাজে গেলাম। আরে না, ঈদের জামাত, উপায় আছে দেরি করণের। আচ্ছা হুনো, কাশেম কাকার বাড়িতে যাবো নামাজ পড়া, মাংস বানাবো, মাংস লইয়া মনে।
তাড়াতাড়ি আইসেন।
দিন আর দিনে খসিয়া পড়িবে।
হুজুর নামাজ দিতেছেন? আপনার টুপির থেকে আমার টুপির দাম বেশি, বদলাইবেন?
খুবই স্পেশাল হয়েছে,
হ্যাঁ
আসলেই মজা হয়েছে। খালি লবণটা দিতে ভুলে গেছিলাম।
আমি আবার অপোজিট পছন্দ করি না।
এইটাই তো ভালো।
দিন আর দিনে খসিয়া পড়িবে।
চেষ্টাটা যে করতে পারছি, সন্তান হয়ে বাপের চিকিৎসা যে করাইতে পারছি, এটাই শান্তি।
হ্যাঁ রান্ধনের হাত খারাপ হইলেও মানে ঝামেলা থাকলেও খাসির মাংসটা ভালো রান্ধে। ভাবি যান আইসেন।
তুই তো বড় বেহারে, তুই তো এরকমের ছিলি না। তুই তো দিয়ে আমার গুনার বাকি করবি।